1975 was an interesting year for the Olds 98, as this would represent the penultimate year for this huge body style. And 1975 was also what I would call a transitional year for the styling of this Oldsmobile, as Oldsmobile started migrating the front end in particular to begin to look increasingly like what would come out in the 1977 model year when these full-size vehicles would be downsized. But this was definitely not a downsized Oldsmobile. In fact, the 1975 Oldsmobile 98 would represent the longest Oldsmobile that was produced in the modern era, and it would measure 232 inches in overall length and right atop 127-inch wheelbase. So this vehicle was just 8 inches shy, actually less than 8 inches shy of being 20 feet long. That is absolutely enormous. Now let's take a look a little bit at some of the styling features of the 75 Olds 98. And like I said, it's kind of a strange transitional year. This admittedly is not my favorite front end of the Olds 98s, but it's got some, well, interesting features. The first thing that you notice is that the typical egg crate grille from the Oldsmobile 98s has been modified here to have kind of a rectangle within a rectangle theme. And this really stood in sharp contrast to the 98 front ends that came before it, including the preceding model year, the 1974, that had, I would call it, a more divided grille. That split grille theme was something that would become a part of Oldsmobile's design DNA after the 1968 model year introduction of that split grille. And the 74 Olds 98 had an even wider split between the portions of the grille and had an egg crate theme similar to other 98s of the era. But here, like I said, you've kind of got the rectangle within a rectangle and even within a rectangle theme. So a little bit of dimension to that overall grille. Now, 1975 was also the first year for the square headlights. And it's kind of a strange front end because you have the eyebrow over the headlamps. I don't know what you want to call it, but that header panel clearly has a raised section in the middle, and that's kind of round, and so is the overall front end. Has quite a few rounded forms associated with it, coupled with creases. But you have these square headlamps, and as time would go on, the 1976 would migrate to a more squarish front end. And then, of course, in 1977, when the car was redesigned, you had a very square front end as well as a boxier car. So you can kind of get a sense of how designers were evolving the front end year by year. Remember, each year the styling changed on the Oldsmobile as well as other vehicles. And they eventually progressed to a design that would stay similar for a number of years once they got to 1977. Now, as we rotate around to the side of the car, we'll notice this vehicle has the optional cornering lamps up front. There's a rather large cornering light. Those were introduced for the first time in 1962 on Cadillacs, and at this point they were becoming relatively popular across vehicles. You can also see the 5-mile-an-hour bumper in the front and how far it hangs out. A massive bumper, almost like a battering ram on these vehicles. And then you have a body side theme that was characteristic of Oldsmobiles during this time frame, and that was the skeg lines. Now here, you have the skeg line kind of starting in front of the front wheel, and then it folds into the wheel arch, or kind of outlines the wheel arch, if you will, which is fat at the bottom and kind of tapers a little bit as it gets toward the top of the wheel, and then fattens again as it moves rearward on the car. And then you can see the skeg line continuing down the body side, where it continues to the fender skirt and then up over the rear portion of the body side. So this, again, was a theme that Oldsmobile had on a number of vehicles, whether it was the 98 or the 88. And I suspect it was perhaps a bit of a variant on the 1966 Tornado theme, although it was clearly different. Oldsmobile was still trying to accentuate its wheel arches, and here they just took a different form, more of a squircle style shape. But again, this was an Oldsmobile body side theme that they had for a number of years in the 70s, and it also even appeared on the Cutlass, where that vehicle had some very distinctive skeg lines. Now, aside from the skeg lines, this vehicle displays a number of characteristics of GM vehicles of this era. First of all, the toothpick A-pillars with the semi-wraparound windshield that was characteristic of all GM full-sizers. And on the four doors, you have the hardtop design here No B-pillar. That little thin metal piece is just attached to the rear window glass. And you have a 6-window upper. You have the rear quarter glass on either side. This was a typical form that was displayed on the GM vehicles of the era. They all used that same windshield, the A-pillars, the front glass, the rear door glass. I think they even used the same quarter glass, the rear quarter glass, but the sheet metal below the belt line was different, completely different, whether that was the fenders or the doors or the rear quarter panels. Now, as we rotate around to the rear view here, you can see that rear quarter glass and then the relatively thin C-pillar. Something always bothered me about that rear quarter glass. It just doesn't look like it's at the right angle relative to the rear door glass and the C-pillar. Well, not my favorite, let's just say, execution of this particular design. I prefer the earlier model years that didn't have the glass in the C-pillar. But the C-pillars were rather chunky, and this was a functional solution. You can also see how sharp that skeg line is in the rear, coming off of the rear door and then basically coming down and forming the lower portion of the fender skirt before completing its form on the rear quarter panel. Now notice behind the rear quarter panel you have these fender extensions here that are a different color, which was very typical because they had to use a different paint, I believe, that was able to flex on these bumper fillers. And so oftentimes you'll see those as being cracked or discolored, and they are expensive to replace. The replacements are not generally good fitting, and you're going to spend a lot with a body repair shop trying to get them to fit correctly. But no, that's something that if you want one of these Olds 98 Regencies of this era, you're just going to have to put up with. But look at how big that fender extension is. That again was for crash standards. That's why you have the big bumper, and you have those Gothic style taillights that we'll take a look at in a second that are so far away from the actual sheet metal of the quarter panel such that area could collapse in the event of a 5-mile-an-hour impact in the rear. And as we rotate to this other side, you can see the Gothic style tail lamps, kind of the element that I named this video after. Oldsmobile 98s had these vertical tail lamps ever since the 1963 model year, and I believe they were really just trying to emulate Cadillac. And a lot of the upper-end General Motors vehicles of this era had vertical tail lamp cues or vertical cues in the rear, again, because they were trying to emulate Cadillac, who had the vertical style tail lamp in many years, or at least a very vertical style rear quarter panel form. I do enjoy the tail panel here and that rubber flubber piece. That's also an extension that's beneath the reverse lights and the little, I'll call it, running lights underneath where it says Olds 98. There's this rubber panel on either side, and that often cracks and degrades, and it just ends up looking like crap. So it's just something to be aware of when you buy one of these vehicles. Like I said, that will cost you a lot of money to replace, thousands of dollars, maybe $2,000 to $3,000 minimum, perhaps even more now. This is also a pretty simple car from a surfacing perspective, but it's very clean and it has some subtlety. Notice the body side here has this kind of concave surface before going convex, and has a really nice bone line that runs the length of the car with a relatively subtle radius to it. And that's about it, aside from the skeg lines. If you wanted to describe this car, you would say have a door that comes out extending away from the window, wraps into a bone line, and then kind of tucks in beneath a lower skeg line. That describes the body side of this vehicle. And here we'll take one more look at this side profile of the Olds 98. Look at that rear overhang. This was an era of rear overhang. Remember, car has a 127-inch wheelbase. This is a long wheelbase. But you'll also notice a very GM trait here. You've got that roof line with the very slight droop to it as it moves rearward. And then you have the C-pillar kind of aligned with the rear wheel. Again, another very GM-y trait. Not quite sure why they did that. Probably, I guess, just for aesthetics. But, well, it looks good. The rear overhang does look a little bit cartoonish with those fender extensions, though, I must say. Now let's switch to the interior of this Copper Canyon Olds 98 Regency, because this is where it gets especially interesting. This is the 1975 Olds IP. It was redesigned for the 1974 model year. Before that, had more of a driver-centric theme to it. Here it still has a little bit of that. you'll notice that some of the gauges, or I should say the radio and the barrel vent above the radio, are rotated toward the driver, but it's much more subtle than it was in 1971 to 1973. You also have the crotch cooler vents there on the below the steering column and below the glove box. Something that you don't see on cars anymore. It did help circulate air and make everybody feel cool when the air conditioning was on. Speaking of air conditioning, this car has Oldsmobile's Tempmatic system. This is no longer Comfortron. In other words, the Comfortron would control the blower speed, the outlet air location, as well as the outlet air temperature. Here, Tempmatic just controls the outlet air temperature, and the driver is responsible for setting the fan speed, which has a switch off to the left, as well as the mode, which is the slider bar up top. So it got less complicated and was a cheaper setup. I think customers actually tended to like it better too. Some didn't like that they couldn't control where the air was coming out on the Comfortron setup. You also notice this car has relatively thin air conditioning vents, these barrel vents, but they work just fine because, remember, this car was running R12 Freon for the air conditioning, which was icy cold, so it didn't require as much airflow. Today, modern cars require so much airflow, in part because the outlet temperature is not as cold. That's to some degree by design, but it's also just a consequence of some of the newer modern air conditioning systems. And here's the best part of the interior in these 98 Regencies, and that is the seats. Now notice the button-tufted, loose cushion style design that you have here in the 1975 Oldsmobile 98 Regency, which really was initiated with the 1972 Oldsmobile 98 Regency when Oldsmobile division manager John Beltz asked his chief interior designer, Blaine Jenkins, what could he do with $100 incremental dollars in the interior. And so the interior designers came up with these button-tufted, loose cushion seats and a similar theme on the door panels that you can see there as well. It was an over-the-top style theme, and actually these seats aren't overly comfortable, amazingly. They look very comfortable, but the foam is a little bit too hard on the back. Of course, now the foam is, let's just say, older, 50 years old pretty much. But still, the seats are, I would say, comfortable, at least compared to modern day seats and standards. And this is what really sold the car. In fact, the 98 Regency was a limited edition in 1972. And then it became so popular, it was offered on the 98, and the interior was offered in many different colors as opposed to just black like it was in 1972. But yeah, this is kind of why you buy one of these vehicles, for the sofa-like interior. And you'd probably also buy it for the rear seat that you see here, which was quite spacious. You got the rear armrest, and like I said, by this point you had the rear quarter glass. So it was a very open and airy cabin in these. And also because of the tumble home of the car, it's pretty funny. There's so much space between the seat back and the door that you can kind of pass things back and forth in between. It's just a function of how wide the car is at the middle and how relatively narrow it is at the top. And that was all done for looks, just to give the car the overall look of width. But yeah, the rear seat passengers also sat in comfort, and they got these big pockets in the back of the front seats in case they wanted to put maps or something else so they could be official backseat drivers. And now we turn under hood for the next to last year for Oldsmobile's 455. Notice that the decal no longer says Oldsmobile Rocket 455 like it did in earlier years, I guess because engineers thought it was no longer the Rocket. Wah wah. By this point, the 455 was making just 190 horsepower. It did make 350 pound-feet of torque. That's not all that much by modern-day standards. I would say if you drive one of these, the engine is just sublime, though. It's so smooth and velvety and quiet, just whisper quiet, that, you know what, the 190 horsepower doesn't matter that much. It's got plenty of low-end grunt. And you'll see a couple things in this engine bay. The cruise control servo there up front. This is an Oldsmobile V8. One of the ways that you can tell is that oil fill cap in the front. Other GM divisions did have the oil fill caps in the front, but by this point, it was really Oldsmobile that did that. And notice the braces that run from the cowl over to the fenders. This would be the last year for them on the 98. In 1976, it was the same car, but they eliminated those braces. likely as a cost-saving move. Now, interestingly, the holes are still there, so you can go and get a set from a 75, 4, 3, 2, 1 Olds 98 and put them in, and you'll get a little bit better structure on your vehicle. These cars do have quite a bit of quivering to them. They were designed to have flexible frames, and the thought was that the flexible frame would just absorb the road shocks and would provide a better ride. And I have to say, in some cases, it did. Some cases, when I've driven these cars, they do ride extremely well, and in other cases, they're very jiggly. It just all depends upon the body assembly, and they were subject to relatively considerable variation, especially given that the build quality during this time frame for General Motors vehicles was not all that great. But the engine and transmission, the turbohydromatic 400 transmission in these vehicles was just a sublime powertrain, absolutely bulletproof, reliable, quiet. The only thing that it just wasn't great at was fuel efficiency. But if you drove it on the freeway, you'd get 14, 15 miles per gallon at 70 miles an hour. Not too bad for a 3-speed automatic and 50-year-old technology with a carburetor and clearly an unaerodynamic shape. But in any case, that is the story of this 1975 Oldsmobile 98 finished in Copper Canyon. Let me know if you like this and put a comment in the comment section. Thanks again for watching.